Hi guys, I am going to discuss the structure of the report in the homework exercises for week 5 because you need to write a report for Workbook 2 and there's not much guidelines in the textbook. So basically you need to start out by setting the scene and outlining your hypotheses and the type of regression you conducted and what variables you entered at which stage. So here you can see it says a study was conducted to explore factors which might affect results on a Japanese test. So that's setting the scene. It was hypothesized that students who had more contact with Japanese people would achieve better results on the Japanese test because they would be more motivated and would have more opportunity to practice. A hierarchical regression, so that's the actual hypothesis. So basically it's a mediational hypothesis. So it was hypothesized that students who have more contact with Japanese people, which you can see shortly is measured by whether or not you have a Japanese friend and involvement in cultural activities, would achieve better results on the Japanese test. So the relationship between these variables and the DV is mediated by is because they would be more motivated and would have more opportunity to practice. So mediated by those two factors. So because of this, a hierarchical regression was performed to test this hypothesis. Level of involvement in Japanese cultural activities and having a Japanese friend were entered at stage 1, so that's how in contact with Japanese people is measured, followed by motivation and opportunity to practice at stage 2. And then you mentioned the two tables, okay? So the intercorrelations between the variables are given in table 1 and the regression statistics are given in table 2. Okay, so you have setting the scene, hypothesis, analyses conducted including which variables were entered at which stage, and then you state that the results, if the correlation matrix or the intercorrelations are presented in table 1, and the results of the regression are entered in table 2. So here you can just see the intercorrelations between the variables, so there is a correlation between Japanese test results and Japanese friends, Japanese test results and cultural involvement, Japanese test results and opportunity to practice, Japanese test results and motivation. So that's the correlation of the DV with all of the variables. The correlation between Japanese friends and the other IV and the two mediators and so on, okay? Notice we're just giving the size of the correlation, and then rather than also stating the p-values, there's just a little asterisk next to the correlations telling you the size of the p-value. So if it has 1 asterisk, then the p-value associated with that correlation is less than 0.05. If it has 2 asterisks, then the p-value associated with that correlation is less than 0.01. If it has 3 asterisks next to it, then the p-value associated with that correlation is less than 0.001. So you can see all of these have p-values less than 0.001. This one is less than 0.05, and this one is less than 0.01. Okay. There's also a little note there stating how Japanese friend has been coded because it's a dichotomous variable. So then in table 2, the regression statistics, you have the squared part correlation, which is basically the part correlation squared, which is basically the variance explained, the unique variance explained by each of the predictors. So you have stage 1 and stage 2. So in stage 1, only Japanese friends and cultural involvement are entered into the regression. So for that, you give the squared part correlations to say how much unique variance is explained by each of these predictors, how much unique variance in the DV is explained by each of these unique predictors. The partial correlation, which is just basically like a correlation, except instead of having a zero order or a raw correlation, it's the only the unique variance between each IV and the predictors. The standardized regression coefficient, which is the beta weights, okay? So instead of giving the B weights, you give the beta weights because they're standardized, so they're on the same scale, so they can be compared to each other. Stage 2, you repeat that again, so the squared part correlation, which is the variance explained by each predictor. Partial correlation is the correlation, but just the unique correlation, so it's a little bit different to the raw correlation you get in table 1, and the standardized regression coefficient again, which is the beta weights. Under each stage, you give R squared, the variance explained by that stage, so 32% of the variance was explained in stage 1, and 17% of the additional variance was explained by adding opportunity to practice and motivation in stage 2, and the total, that's R squared change, the total variance explained by the whole model once all of the predictors have been added in stage 2 is 49%. So that's basically the R squared at stage 1 and the R squared changed in stage 2 added together gives you the total R squared for the model. Okay, again they've got the p-values indicated at the bottom. They've also got n underneath each table as well. Okay, so then you basically start by talking about the amount of variance explained in each step. So the amount of contact with Japanese people explains a substantial percentage of the variation in Japanese test results. So the amount of contact with Japanese people is measured as the variables entered at stage 1. So the variables included in the first stage of the regression, level of cultural involvement and having a Japanese friend, together explain 32% of the variation in test results in the DV. So that's here, from here, 32%. Introducing motivation and opportunity to practice, the two variables entered at stage 2, explains an additional 17% of the variation, which is here, the R squared change. Okay, so you always discuss the overall percentage of variance explained for each step of the model. So that's what you do next. And then after that, you need to start thinking about the hypotheses and when you compare the results in table 1 and 2, what that is telling us about the specific hypotheses. So we're interested in whether the relationship between the variables entered at stage 1 and the DV differs once the variables entered in stage 2 have been added. So at the first stage of the regression, both having a Japanese friend and involvement in cultural activities contribute significantly to the regression. However, at the second stage of the regression, after motivation and opportunity to practice have been taken into account, level of cultural involvement is no longer significant. So we're going to discuss level of cultural involvement first. This is consistent with our hypothesis that cultural involvement affects test results indirectly through its influence on motivation and opportunity to practice. It's basically saying this is consistent with the proposition that the relationship between cultural involvement and the DV is mediated by opportunity to practice and motivation. So as can be seen in table 1, students who are more involved with cultural activities tend to be both more motivated and have more opportunity to practice, which in turn produces better results. So you can see the correlations which prove that there's a mediational relationship there in stage 1, in table 1, the correlation matrix. So now we discuss the hypothesis in regards to having a Japanese friend. So this pattern is only partly repeated for having a Japanese friend. The partial correlation for this variable is much weaker at stage 2 of the regression at stage 1. And this is predominantly because students who have a Japanese friend tend to be more motivated, because the correlation between having a Japanese friend and the two mediators is stronger for motivation than it is for opportunity to practice. That's what that's saying. So the partial correlation for this variable, this is predominantly because students who have a Japanese friend tend to be more motivated. Surprisingly, there is only a very weak correlation between having a Japanese friend and opportunity to practice. See table 1. However, even after level of motivation and opportunity to practice are taken into account, students who have a Japanese friend still score significantly higher on the Japanese test. So having a Japanese friend not only affects test results indirectly, through its effect on motivation, it also has some direct effect. So if you watch the video explaining the homework exercises before this video, I've talked about this. So basically what we're talking about here is that, you might not be able to see it here, the partial correlation between Japanese friends and the DV remains, it hasn't given us that. The standardized regression coefficient in stage 2 but for Japanese friends remains significant. So even after, it's lower than it was at stage 1. So it shows that adding these two, there must be some shared variance between these two variables and this variable with the DV, which means that the regression coefficient declines, but it still remains significant at step 2. Okay, so there is some direct relationship between Japanese friends and performance on an oral test. So basically our hypothesis is supported, but it doesn't, motivation and opportunity to practice doesn't entirely explain the relationship between having a Japanese friend and performance on an oral test. Okay, so basically these last couple of paragraphs have discussed the results in terms of the hypothesis. And then you need to talk about, I don't know what's this one, there is quite a substantial difference in test results between students who have a Japanese friend and those who don't. Even after taking into account level of involvement in cultural activities, the amount of opportunity to practice Japanese, and level of motivation on average students with a Japanese friend. What? Even after taking into account level of involvement in cultural activities, the amount of opportunity to practice and level of motivation, on average, students with Japanese friends score 4 marks higher than other students. So this is just adding a little bit more information about the impact of having a Japanese friend, because having a Japanese friend remains significant at stage 2. We're just talking about, so this is discussing how hypothesis is supported, and this is saying that, however, having a Japanese friend still has impact the relationship between performance or an oral test, even after controlling for the mediating variables and cultural involvement. Okay, so that's actually telling you, even after taking into account level of involvement in cultural activities, the amount of opportunity to practice Japanese, and level of motivation, on average, should be a comma there, students with a Japanese friend score 4 marks higher than other students. Now, you then discuss which variable is the most important. So, while opportunity to practice and having a Japanese friend are both significant and substantial predictors of test results, the most important predictor in our regression model is motivation. This variable explains 9% of the variation in test results over and above that explained by the other predictors. So you need to add a comment about which predictor is the most important. And then you do your conclusion. In summary, the model partially supports our hypotheses. Level of involvement in cultural activities only affects test results indirectly through its impact on motivation and opportunity to practice, which we know because it was no longer significant at stage 2. Students who are more involved in cultural activities tend to be more motivated and also to have more opportunity to practice. In turn, being more motivated and having more opportunity to practice tends to produce better test results. And then the conclusion for the other predictor, having a Japanese friend had remarkably little influence on opportunity to practice, but influences test results both directly and indirectly through its effect on motivation. Students who have a Japanese friend tend to be more motivated and hence to get better test results. Now notice that this is all in present tense because it's discussing the population. Okay, so hopefully that will help you a little bit. So basically you start with your hypotheses, which you guys should be ace at by now. You describe the analyses you did and which variables were entered at which stage of the regression, and then you give the results in table 1 and 2. So you give a correlation matrix in table 1. In table 2, you list all the predictors, give the squared part correlation, the partial correlation, and the beta weights, or the standardized regression coefficients for each stage, the R-squared change for each stage, and the total variance explained by the model. Then you go on to, in your text, describe how much variation is explained at each stage, discuss the variables from the standpoint of your hypotheses, discuss anything that differs from your hypotheses, talk about which variable is the most important, and then explains the most variance in the DV, and then you summarize your findings in regards to your hypothesis for each of the predictors that you were hypothesizing about. Okay, so that's all you need to do. So it's not as clear cut as previous reports, but you have to have certain sentences with particular sentence structures. One of my videos that I'm just doing at the moment talks about interpreting part and partial correlations and the way that you structure sentences when doing so, and that's relevant to these reports. So if you're going to interpret the partial correlation, for example, you need to make sure you're doing it properly. But there's quite a lot of freedom in how you structure the report, because once they start getting this complex, it really depends on what your hypotheses were and what the actual results of the tests were. So it is a mental effort. You do need to sit and think about what the results actually mean and how you're going to explain that. And that's normal. That's what researchers have to do. And there's not always black and white rules about how we're going to do that. Okay, so if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. The good news is there's not heaps on reports. I couldn't see any reports in the practical test or on the exam, so there is a report in Workbook 2, but it's the only report I've managed to see so far. So that's, other than manovers, there will be some reports for that, but for the regressions I couldn't see any other reports. So that's the good news.